The year is 1968, and the air in northern England is heavy with coal dust, factory smoke, and the restless hum of a society in transition. Newcastle upon Tyne is a city caught between the fading shadow of the industrial age and the uncertain dawn of something new. But deep within its crumbling neighborhoods, hidden behind rows of soot-stained brick and hollow-eyed terraces, lies a place where the old world has rotted away without ever being replaced. The Scotswood Estate, a neighborhood of broken glass, boarded doors, and derelict buildings. Its alleyways echo with the cries of children who have never seen a playground that wasn't littered with rust and rubble. Its walls are cracked with damp and painted with graffiti, the kind that stains but never decorates. And in the middle of this gray, forgotten world stands a little girl. Her name is Mary Floribel. She has black hair cropped into a neat curl around her ears. Her face is pale, her expression oddly serious for a child her age. She is small, delicate even, but her eyes are wide, unblinking, and disturbingly empty. They do not reflect the innocence of a child at play. They hold instead a strange stillness, a cold calculation. This is no ordinary child. This is a girl who in the span of a single summer will strangle the life from two boys not much younger than herself. She will leave behind families in ruins, a community in disbelief, and a question that has haunted psychologists for decades. How can a child become a killer? To understand Mary Bell, we must first understand the world in which she was born. Scotswood in the late 1960s was a place stripped of color. Once the beating heart of shipbuilding and heavy industry, it had collapsed into poverty when the old factories began to shut their gates. The men who once labored in the yards now sat idle on street corners, their pride replaced with bitter silence. The women, often little more than girls themselves, carried babies on their hips and bruises on their arms. Children ran barefoot across cracked cobblestones. Their playgrounds were piles of rubble, their toys salvaged scraps of twisted metal. The laughter of these children did not sound entirely like joy. It was a hard laughter, sharp-edged, born of survival rather than play. The houses were stacked tight, rows upon rows of terraced homes leaning into one another as if afraid to stand alone. Their windows rattled in the wind. Their chimneys exhaled the last sighs of coal smoke. Inside, life was no warmer. Alcohol flowed freely, tempers ran hot, and neglect was passed down like an inheritance. This is where Mary grew up, not in the glow of bedtime stories or under the shelter of a loving embrace, but in the cold shadows of a society that had forgotten her before she could even speak. Mary Bell entered the world on May 26, 1957, but her birth was not greeted with joy. Her mother, Betty Bell, was just 16 years old, a troubled girl already marked by instability. Betty had been entangled in prostitution from a young age, a teenager navigating a world of men far older and far crueler than she could manage. To her, a child was not a gift. It was an anchor, a burden she had no interest in carrying. Neighbors whispered of disturbing things, that Betty had tried to rid herself of Mary in infancy, that she once attempted to give the baby sleeping pills disguised as sweets, that she spoke openly about wishing the child would disappear. Imagine that. Your first experience of love is not a cradle or a lullaby, but the sting of rejection. A mother's hand not to comfort, but to harm. From her earliest days, Mary absorbed a truth that would etch itself into her psyche. She was unwanted. Betty was rarely present. She vanished for days at a time, leaving Mary with relatives who saw her not as a child, but as a nuisance. And when Betty was home, the atmosphere was worse. Violence hung in the air, sometimes physical, sometimes emotional, always scarring. The scars of such an upbringing are not always visible, but they shape the mind like water carves into stone. By the time Mary reached school age, her teachers saw something unusual. She was intelligent, yes, quick with words, sharper than most children her age, but her cleverness came wrapped in cruelty. She lied with ease, not the small fibs of children, but elaborate stories woven with disturbing precision. She manipulated other children, turning them against one another, delighting in the confusion she created. And then there were the acts of violence. Small animals, birds, mice, even neighborhood pets began to disappear. Their bodies were later found, twisted and mutilated. The other children whispered Mary's name. They knew she had done it. When confronted, she would smile. A smile without warmth. A smile that was almost a dare. There's something chilling about a child who understands death. Most children shrink from it, their innocence a shield against its weight. But Mary seemed drawn to it, fascinated by the stillness of it. Notice this. Mary did not act in rage. She did not flail or lash out. She acted with calm, with intention, with control. Around this time, Mary attached herself to another girl, Norma Joyce Bell. Despite their shared surname, they were not related. Norma was older, 13 years old, but far less intelligent. She was slow, pliable, desperate to be included. Mary recognized this weakness and seized it. She became the leader, and Norma, the willing follower. Together they roamed the streets of Scotswood, their presence both curious and unsettling. Witnesses would later recall seeing them together, their hands wrapped around the throats of smaller children in the playground, squeezing until the children cried, then laughing as they released them. Adults dismissed it. Rough play, mischief, nothing more. But the truth is clear now. These were rehearsals, practice runs for something far darker. On May 25, 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, Mary was restless. There was something simmering beneath her calm exterior, a hunger she had not yet satisfied. That afternoon, she was seen wandering with Norma. They taunted children, shoved them, pressed their small hands against their throats. It was a performance in miniature. But that evening, the performance would become reality. 4-year-old Martin Brown was a cheerful child, known in the neighborhood for his bright smile and boundless curiosity. On that late May Day, he wandered into an abandoned house at 85 St. Margaret's Road. The house was one of many derelicts that dotted Scotswood. Windows shattered, wallpaper peeling in strips, floorboards splintered and soft with damp. To the children, it was a wonderland, a secret fortress. Inside, however, became a tomb. When Martin's body was found, he lay motionless on the floor, his lips tinged with blue. There were no bruises, no blood, nothing to suggest a struggle. The police assumed it had been an accident. Perhaps he had swallowed something poisonous. But in truth, he had been strangled. Imagine it. The tiny hands of an 11-year-old girl tightening around the throat of a 4-year-old boy. Imagine the calmness required, the patience to hold on until life slipped away. And when it was done, when Martin lay still, Mary did not weep. She did not panic. She walked away. The following night, as the neighborhood reeled in grief, another act shocked the community. A local nursery was broken into. Toys lay strewn across the floor. Scribbled notes were left behind in crude handwriting, their message unmistakable. One read, "A murder so that I may come back." Another, "We did murder Martin Brown." At the time, police dismissed them as childish pranks. Who could believe children capable of murder? But they were not pranks. They were confessions. Mary's confessions. And notice this. The words are not of guilt or remorse. They are of pride. They are taunt. This is a child who does not fear discovery. This is a child who craves it. The death of Martin Brown was not the end. It was a beginning, a test, a first taste. For Mary Bell, killing was not about rage. It was not about revenge. It was about power. The ultimate control, to hold life in her hands and decide when it would end. And now, having tasted that power, once she would crave again. The summer of 1968 had only just begun, and already. One boy lay in his grave, a family torn apart. But the true horror had yet to unfold, because Mary Bell, the little girl with the empty eyes, was only just beginning her dance with death. And before the summer was over, another child would meet the same fate. The days after Martin Brown's death passed in uneasy silence. The police spoke of accident, of tragedy, of a boy who had simply wandered into danger and not returned. But in the streets of Scotswood, the children whispered. They had seen things, felt things. And at the center of those whispers stood Mary Bell, her black curls framing her pale face, her expression calm, detached. There was no grief in her, no fear. If anything, there was satisfaction, because Mary knew something the others did not. She knew that she had taken a life and gotten away with it. The thrill was intoxicating, but satisfaction never lasts long. For some, once is enough. For others, once only awakens the hunger. Mary was not finished. After Martin's death, Mary seemed almost electrified. Her teachers noticed her strange behavior. She drew pictures of children lying dead. She spoke casually about the boy's funeral, as if it were entertainment. One chilling account recalls her telling classmates that she had killed Martin, not as a confession, but as a boast. When the children laughed or ignored her, she simply shrugged and repeated it over and over, as if daring them to believe her. Notice this. The crime had given her a new identity. She was no longer just another unwanted child lost in the shadows of Scotswood. She was different. She held a secret that placed her above them all. But secrets demand expression. And for Mary, the silence was unbearable. She needed to act again. In the weeks that followed, Mary's behavior grew darker. She began seeking out children smaller and weaker than herself, and testing the limits of her control. One disturbing incident was recalled by a neighborhood mother. Mary had brought a little girl to her doorstep, the child shaken and gasping. The mother asked what had happened. She fell, Mary said flatly. But the truth was that Mary had been pressing her small hands around the girl's throat, watching the panic rise in her eyes. There was no rage, no wildness, only a calm smile, the smile of a child discovering that she could create fear. Meanwhile, Scotswood moved on. The death of Martin Brown was filed away as an accident. The police, the adults, even the newspapers, they wanted to believe. Who could imagine a child as a killer? It was easier to bury the thought than to confront it, easier to leave the dark corners unexplored. And so, as adults turned their gaze elsewhere, the streets once again became Mary's kingdom. On July 31st, 1968, just 2 months after Martin's death, Mary found her next victim, 3-year-old Brian Howe. Brian was a small boy with blonde hair, the kind of child who followed older kids with innocent trust. He lived in the same neighborhood, played in the same broken streets. He had no reason to fear Mary. To him, she was just another girl, a bit older, a bit bossy, but still a child. And when Mary called his name, he followed. The day was hot, the air thick with the smell of oil and soot. Children ran in packs, kicking cans, shouting through the narrow passageways. Mary led Brian away from the noise. Norma trailed behind, uneasy but unwilling to resist. They wandered into a wasteland of rubble and tall grass, a patch of land behind the houses, where the remnants of demolition lay scattered. It was a place children knew well, a place of dares and secret games. But this was no game. Mary's voice was calm, almost sweet. She told Brian to come closer. She told him to lie down. And then, with hands no larger than his own, she pressed against his throat. Imagine this moment. A child's laughter fading into gasps, gasps into silence. The hands squeezing tighter, the body squirming, the life draining. Norma stood by watching, terrified but frozen. And Mary did not flinch. She held on until the small boy's body went limp. Most killers flee. They panic. They hide. But Mary lingered. She looked at the body, curious, almost scientific. She began to play with it, moving Brian's arms, touching his hair. Then, chillingly, she took scissors and cut into his skin. She carved an M into his stomach. The scene was grotesque, and yet she seemed fascinated. Norma later claimed Mary laughed as she worked, that she treated Brian's body like a doll. And then when she was done, she left him there, hidden among the grass, discarded like broken glass. When Brian did not come home, his family searched the streets. Neighbors joined in, calling his name, voices echoing through the dusk. And then someone found him. There in the scrubland lay the small body. His face was peaceful, almost sleeping, but the marks on his neck, the wounds on his stomach, told a darker truth. This was no accident. This was murder. And this time, the police could not dismiss it. But the story does not end here. The day after the murder, as Brian's family gathered in grief, Mary appeared at their doorstep. Imagine it, the killer herself, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with false concern. "Do you miss your Brian?" she asked his sister, her voice flat, emotionless. "Do you cry for him?" It was not sympathy. It was curiosity. Mary wanted to see grief up close. She wanted to watch the pain she had created. The police began to question children in the area. Among them, Mary and Norma. Mary sat calmly, speaking with confidence, denying everything. But her composure was too perfect, too rehearsed. And then, in her eagerness, she slipped. She mentioned details of Brian's wounds, details the police had not released. How could she have known unless she had been there? The mask was cracking. Notice how Mary moves. Not like a child, not like a panic suspect. She moves like a predator, careful but arrogant, believing herself untouchable. But predators always leave traces, and the more they act, the more those traces multiply. Mary's second crime was not only bloodier, it was sloppier, and in her arrogance, she revealed herself. By August of 1968, the people of Scotswood could no longer pretend. 2 children were dead, 2 families broken, and whispers turned into suspicion. The police had their eyes on Marybelle, the little girl with the empty eyes, and soon the world would too. August 1968. The summer heat had begun to fade, but the air in Scotswood carried a new kind of tension. The laughter of children was quieter now, cautious, clipped. Parents watched from doorways, their eyes sharp, their nerves raw. 2 boys were dead, And though few dared to speak it aloud, suspicion lingered like smoke in the air. It pointed unthinkably toward two girls. Mary Bell, 11 years old. Norma Bell, 13 years old. The murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe had broken the illusion of safety. And soon, the community's worst fear would be confirmed. The killers were not men lurking in shadows, nor monsters slipping in from elsewhere. They were children. The police began with questions, at first gentle, then pressing. Norma cracked quickly. Her words spilled out in fragments, halting, confused. She spoke of following Mary, of watching, of being too afraid to stop her. Mary, however, was different. She sat in the chair with her legs crossed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her voice was calm, her answers measured. She lied smoothly without hesitation, weaving stories that bent toward her favor. But then the slip. When asked about Brian Howe, she mentioned the pair of scissors. How could she have known about them? That detail had not been released. The room grew still. The officers exchanged glances. They had their proof. Mary Bell was no longer a child of suspicion. She was a child of certainty. On August 5, 1968, Mary and Norma were charged with murder. The image of Mary being led away remains etched in memory. An 11-year-old girl, small enough to vanish inside her oversized coat, walking with eerie calm between uniformed officers. No tears, no cries, only the same cold, unblinking eyes. Norma wept. She clutched at her mother, protesting, insisting it wasn't her fault. But Mary remained detached, as if she were merely an observer of her own fate. It was this calmness, this absence of fear, that unsettled even hardened policemen. The news exploded across Britain. Child killer. Girl of 11 charged with murder. Headlines screamed from every paper, each more sensational than the last. The nation was horrified, transfixed. The idea that a child could commit such crimes shattered the very concept of childhood itself. What did it mean if innocence was no longer guaranteed by age? And what kind of world had produced a Mary Bell? The trial began on December 5, 1968, at Newcastle Assizes. The courtroom was packed, journalists, psychologists, curious onlookers. The atmosphere was charged with disbelief, with morbid curiosity. Mary entered wearing a neat dress. Her small frame made the wooden benches seem oversized, swallowing her whole. She looked like a schoolgirl on an outing, until one met her eyes. Those eyes, cold, detached, assessing. Norma sat beside her, larger, but visibly broken. Her face blotched from crying, her posture slumped. Together they made a strange picture, innocence and guilt twisted into a shape no one could fully comprehend. The prosecution laid out the facts. Martin Brown, 4 years old, strangled in an abandoned house. Brian Howe, 3 years old, strangled and mutilated in a wasteland. The break-in at the nursery, with chilling notes confessing to the murder. The witnesses who saw Mary trying to throttle other children in the weeks before the killings. Piece by piece, the picture grew darker. Norma's testimony painted Mary as the leader, the manipulator. Norma herself was portrayed as weak, frightened, unable to resist Mary's influence. The defense attempted to argue that Mary was not fully responsible, that her upbringing, her age, her damaged psyche made her incapable of understanding the full weight of her actions. But then came the psychiatric evaluations. Dr. David Westbury, a child psychiatrist, described Mary as displaying classic signs of psychopathy. He spoke of her intelligence, her lack of remorse, her compulsive lying, her fascination with violence. She was, in his words, a child with an abnormality of personality, unable to feel genuine emotion, unable to distinguish right from wrong in the way most children do. In simpler terms, Mary was dangerous, not because she was evil in the way adults understood it, but because she was empty. The jury listened in silence. How do you weigh the guilt of a child who lacks the very thing that makes us human, empathy? On December 17, 1968, after 9 days of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Norma Bell acquitted. Mary Bell guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge, Justice Cusack, pronounced his sentence: detention for life. Mary was only 11 years old. She would be sent not to a prison, but to a secure facility, a place where the state hoped she might be contained, studied, perhaps even rehabilitated. But no sentence could erase the truth. An 11-year-old child had killed, twice. As Mary was led away, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and whispers rippled through the courtroom. But Mary herself remained silent. Her face betrayed no fear, no regret, only that same unreadable calm. Outside, the world debated. Some called her a monster. Others called her a victim. And in the quiet streets of Scotswood, the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe grieved. For them, there was no debate. There was only loss. Notice how society split in its judgment of Mary Bell. Was she the product of evil or its embodiment? Was she a child shaped by abuse and neglect, or something darker? Something born within her? The questions linger unanswered, because the truth is uncomfortable. Mary Bell was both victim and killer, both child and monster. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most, that innocence and cruelty can exist side by side, even in the same small hands. The trial ended. The verdict was given. The case was closed. But Mary Bell's story did not end there. For though she vanished behind the walls of secure institutions, her name lingered in Britain's memory, whispered in classrooms, printed in newspapers, debated in courts. And as the years passed, her story would resurface again and again, each time reopening the wound she left behind. Because how do you ever forget that an 11-year-old girl could kill? The city of Newcastle carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Workers at the shipyards, mothers shopping at the corner grocer, children darting through alleys, chasing one another's laughter. On the surface, life moved in predictable cycles. But beneath that hum of everyday survival was a slow, invisible fracture spreading through the community. A fracture with a name that no one wanted to speak aloud. The city whispered it. Mothers shuddered at it. Children repeated it with the fascination one might give to a ghost story. For the people of Scotswood, Mary was no longer simply the troubled little girl from a neglected home. She had become the embodiment of a nightmare that no one could wake from. And yet, Mary herself walked among them, flesh and blood. A child with a bow in her hair, a defiant tilt to her chin, and those eyes that seemed to look straight through you. By late 1968, rumors about Mary were everywhere. At school, other children avoided her, yet could not look away. Some were drawn to her dangerous aura, like moths circling a flame. Teachers, hardened by years in Scotswood's rough classrooms, found themselves rattled. They described her as cold, strange, and uncontrollable. The deaths of Martin Brown and Brian had already placed the neighborhood under a microscope. Police cars patrolled the streets more frequently. Journalists hovered with their notebooks, and parents locked their doors earlier at night. Still, the sense of who could have committed such crimes remained a fog of uncertainty. Most adults simply could not reconcile the idea that an 11-year-old girl could strangle the life out of toddlers without remorse. But children saw it differently. They had seen Mary's cruel games, her sudden flashes of violence, the way she delighted in causing harm. Some whispered stories of how she had tried to choke classmates, how she laughed about death, as though it were punchline. The innocence of childhood had no place in Mary's world, and yet she remained one of them. To understand Mary Bell is to stand at the crossroads of innocence and evil, where a fragile mind fractures into something darker. At home, she was still subjected to the cold cruelty of her mother, Betty Bell, a woman known for her neglect and her deep instability. Betty's own demons seeped into her daughter's world like poison through a cracked wall. Reports suggest that Betty attempted to kill Mary on multiple occasions when she was younger, even forcing pills down her throat. Mary had survived, but survival came at a price. Psychologists later argued that Mary's crimes were not born from sheer malice alone, but from a childhood stripped of safety and love. Instead, she was marinated in abuse, chaos, and rejection. But notice something crucial. Countless children suffer abuse. Countless children grow up unloved. And yet, they do not all turn into killers. So what was it in Mary, this particular child, that twisted cruelty into her only form of power? Was it innate? Was it her cold detachment, her inability to empathize? Or was it learned, absorbed from the violence and neglect around her like smoke clinging to cloth? The answer remains a shadow, but the evidence was mounting. Mary was not merely the victim. She was something else entirely. As summer drifted into autumn, police began to assemble a portrait of the killer. Clues were stacking against Mary and her friend, Norma Bell. No relation, though their shared surname confused the headlines. Witness statements placed Mary at the scenes. Children recounted her disturbing comments. And then there were the chilling confessions she made, half boasts, half taunts, slipped casually into conversation. One boy told police that Mary had cornered him and said, "I like hurting little things. I like hurting them because they can't fight back." Detectives, hardened men who had seen violence in many forms, felt their stomachs tighten. These were not the words of a child at play. These were the words of something far colder. Still, Scotland Yard moved carefully. The idea of arresting a child for murder was almost unthinkable. The newspapers were already circling like vultures. Every move had to be precise. So the police waited. They gathered. They watched. But Mary wasn't hiding. In fact, she seemed to invite the attention. BBB one afternoon, only weeks after Brian Howe's funeral, witnesses spotted Mary loitering near the cemetery. She stood by the fresh earth where the boy had been laid to rest, watching the flowers wilt in the cool autumn air. And then she scratched at the soil with her fingers. She dug lightly, idly, as though she were trying to unearth something hidden beneath the mound. A local woman saw her, horrified. She later told investigators that Mary's face in that moment wasn't solemn with grief, nor curious in innocence. It was satisfied. Imagine that. An 11-year-old child, standing at the grave of the boy she had strangled, disturbing the earth with quiet glee. This detail shocked detectives. For them, it was no longer a question of suspicion. It was proof of something deeply abnormal, a callousness beyond comprehension. But it was also proof of something else. Mary wanted to be caught. By November 1968, the pressure was unbearable. The police had their suspicions, the community had their fears, and the journalists had their headlines half-written. Behind closed doors, meetings were held, evidence was weighed, and decisions were sharpened like knives. How do you bring an 11-year-old to justice? Do you treat her as a child or as a murderer? That dilemma sat like a stone in the gut of the investigators. They knew delay risked another child's life. Yet, rushing could collapse the case altogether. And all the while, Mary watched. Mary played. Mary waited. The city of Newcastle seemed to pause in uneasy silence, waiting for the moment when the police would finally act. Parents clutched their children closer, fearful that the next victim was already marked. And when the moment came, it would be unlike anything Britain had ever seen. The knock came first. A quiet tap on a front door in Scotswood. The officers shifted uneasily, hats in their hands, their faces set like stone. Inside, footsteps approached. The door creaked open, and there stood Mary Bell, small, smiling, waiting. The officers looked at her, this child, and knew. Behind that smile was the weight of death itself. They had come to take her away,